I don't know if you guys saw this report from the Washington Post. I haven't seen a lot of coverage of this. In fact, this is from the end of last month. I didn't find out about this until very recently. Honestly, is a really shocking leak that I think shows a shift in our foreign policy that should be very warning for our European allies, and of course a big warning for the Russians, as in, maybe a dinner bell. So what this report indicates is a lot. First off, it indicates that the Heritage Foundation has a lot of influence on our administration, because this secret memo that was now has gotten out to the public, is being reported on by the Washington Post, has a lot of stuff based upon a Heritage Foundation report that was made before the administration got elected. And that one of the chief authors of that report actually happened to be Pete Hegseth. So it is a lot of Pete Hegseth repeating what he said before with the Heritage Foundation, the same Heritage Foundation with the 2025 project that the Trump administration tried to distance itself from. Now these reports are coming back and almost like word by word being just restated now as official Pentagon reports that are being distributed to, different legislators, different parts of the government, as they're trying to understand where American foreign policy is going forward when it comes to national defense. And what we got in this report is a lot of this beat for beat repetition of what we got from the Heritage Report before the war. And I wanted to go through some of this because there is a lot that I think indicates a China-centric approach to U.S. foreign policy during the Trump years. If this is adhered to, if this strategy, if this memo being put out by the Pentagon and being championed by the Heritage Foundation is stuck to, and so far I haven't heard any rumblings from the administration that this isn't the pathway they want to take, then we're talking about a China hawk-dominated American foreign policy for the next 4 years. So let's start with some of the big ones, okay? The interim guidance is 9 pages. Several passages throughout are similar to a longer 2024 report by the Heritage Foundation, some of which are nearly identical, according to the Washington Post analysis of both documents. One of the Heritage Report's co-authors, Alexander Valina-Grin, is now in an interim role as the Pentagon's top policy official. The Heritage Report, published in August, recommends that the Pentagon prioritize 3 core issues. Taiwan invasion deterrence, in order to try to stop the Chinese from invading Taiwan, which I agree. I agree that should be an American priority. It's one of the biggest hotspots in the world. It would disrupt global trade. Even though Donald Trump just instituted tariffs on Taiwan, some of them blanket, including on the microchips that we need for crucial U.S. goods and technological imports. But, we need to protect its economic interests. We're tariffing in the meantime, I guess, I'm not saying that the policy is consistent. In fact, multiple times in this report, there's complaints or reported complaints from legislators and government officials who talk about it being contradictory many times, both asking for us to be everywhere all at once, but also we're withdrawing from everywhere all at once. It's very it wants to be everything, And if you want to be everything, you can't, it's kind of hard to be anything. And certainly if you're trying to do it while cost cutting. Anyway, as I was saying, 3 core issues: preventing an invasion of Taiwan through deterrence, which I agree with; homeland defense, how that can be interpreted depends upon what you think is a homeland defense priority, because I would agree that we should have some air defense. I should agree that we should have some homeland defense. But if homeland defense, as much of what the report indicated, is the use of American military resources in order to try to enforce immigration law, when these soldiers have not been trained in how to do that, well, then, we're in a different environment here. We're in a different situation. And that's going to be expensive. And I think, and part of the justification in the report from the Heritage Foundation for these, cuts of our support around the world is the expenses on the needs for homeland defense. And this report also talks about the needs for investing in bunker-busting bombs, stuff that can really destroy Chinese defensives, so we can continue this long-arm approach to China fighting, which is, if we go to war with China, we're taking a war to them. We're taking a war to their artificial islands. We're taking the war to their coastline. We're taking the war to to China, instead of a defense approach. We have really an offensive approach here. that I think the Trump administration is indicating they want to continue to go down that route, which is not surprising that the bigger is better guy wants to take that strategy, which I think is going to be expensive than the defensive defense approach, which would give us more flexibility to allocate resources elsewhere. But that is not what they're choosing to do. And now we are going to watch the results of that. Also, yes, the congressional aide said it was readily apparent to Capitol Hill staff that the document bore the influence of the conservative think tank. Major General Garrick Harmon, the head of strategy and plans at Africa Command, recommended to staff that they read the Heritage Report as part of a discussion on how to align their priorities with the new Pentagon guidance, according to a command staff member who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss the internal deliberations. Other officials within the command distributed a copy of the Heritage Report, the staff member said. Now, when they reached out to them to ask them about this, they basically just kind of blew them off, to be completely honest. I would say that the biggest thing out of all of this that scares me is, and we'll go through the Heritage Report in a second to give you an idea of, because so far this is a 9-page report that's not taking everything from the Heritage Report, but if it continues to go down that road, we have some concerns. But the biggest thing from the Pentagon report before we go to the Heritage Report it's based off of is this last one. This last priority, increase burden sharing among allies and partners. Now, I think the Germans should pay more. I think that the British should pay more. I think that all these nation states should be investing more in their defense and to support our Ukrainian allies. But the way that the report reads, and definitely the way that the Heritage Report we're about to read reads, is an idea of us pulling back to the point where we're providing possibly no support whatsoever. And whether or not that would end up being the case, because we have economic priorities in Europe, we have, a traditional, historic relationship, which the Trump administration has actually chosen to bash by saying, when people say, hey, we've been such historical allies, they say, yes, they've had 70 years to fix all these issues, and they haven't. So are they our allies really? That's the type of questioning. They don't look at that relationship and the length of that relationship and the depth of that relation as a positive. They're trying to turn it into a negative. So let's go into the Heritage Report, which this Pentagon report is based upon, and talk about the types of things that we could very well hear about in the future, because this was touted by Pete Hegseth, our Defense Secretary, and those who came with him, who co-authored it. One moment. Let me just get the list of items from it. So just like I talked about earlier with this request for allies to spend more in defense, a big part here is a request for Taiwan to spend about 10% of its GDP on defense. Now, there is no American ally on the planet that spends 10% of its GDP on defense. 10% of GDP on defense is more than I think of any country. I can't think of a country that spends more than 10% than GDP on defense than countries that are actively at war. Now, I understand that Taiwan is a small country and it has to do a lot to contribute. And the president of Taiwan is trying to adapt to Trump and adapt to these demands by announcing that they're going to increase their spending on defense from 2.5% to 3% of GDP. But that's still 7%. That's still 7 points off. And 10% on defense, I don't know how the Taiwanese economy domestically burdens that. Again, it's not that I don't think they should be spending more, maybe 4% or maybe even 5%, depending on how tense it gets and et cetera. But when we're talking about 10%, these are unrealistic goals. These are goals that I don't think are going to be diplomatically plausible within Taiwan, and a burden that is going to be hard for them to hold running the long run. I think it might be an attempt to get them to, hey, if we take 10% and they're at 2.5%, maybe we end up at 6%. That could be the logic there. But I also know that Trump can be quite hard-headed. They could throw out a number like that as a negotiating tactic and then get angry that they reject it, which is going to be inevitable, just like what happened with the Ukrainians when it comes to the minerals deal, where now the Trump administration is getting pissed because the Ukrainians will not accept the minerals deal that would stop them from joining the European Union, saying that they have to accept it, that they cannot even renegotiate it. I mean, the big part of this report that I really wanted to point to, the Heritage Foundation report, is just the leaning into of the fact that the United States cannot be in Europe and China at the same time And so we can't be in the Indo-Pacific guarding our interests and in Africa and all these other places. So we have to choose, and we choose the Indo-Pacific, meaning that we could essentially be providing no aid to Europe in the event of further Russian incursions, of further Russian attacks. Meaning that if the Russians restart the war, say in 2027, 2 years, or 2026, 2 to 3 years into Trump's presidency, under that Heritage Foundation guideline, which Pete Hegseth wrote as the current defense secretary, there's a possibility of us sending nothing to support the Ukrainians, especially since the mineral deal talks nothing at all about continued aid to the Ukrainians. This is a plan that, if true, and it isn't a Pentagon memo, and if we go forward with the Heritage Foundation plans that it was based upon, would be, again, like a dinner bell for the Russians. It would be a declaration that in future conflicts it's going to be easier. Because the whole pitch that I get from the people who, even those who really try to wiggle the ways out of saying security guarantees are not important for the Ukrainians, is this idea that this war has been so painful, it has been so bloody, it has been so awful, that the Russians would never continue this war because how much of their youth have died, how much of their youth have fallen fighting it. And now they're going to go out there and do it again? Oh my God, it was so painful, so expensive. But if the Russian public has been convinced that they won the war, and if they can point to the annexations of these territories, and the Russian political elite have convinced themselves that it was a decent idea and that they won the war, which of course is convenient for them because they're the ones who engage in the war. And then we find out, or they find out, that next time, after they've taken 20 to 25% of Ukraine under their current demands, the United States is not going to be there, which provided 40% of Ukraine's support. What message does that send to a war-hungry Kremlin? It's one that could create chaos on the European continent, depending on Europe's speed in picking up their own spear. We don't know that this Heritage Foundation report is going to become, all of its details, part of administration policy, but so far, the administration seems to be matching it step by step. And that means a lack of American support for Europe against an insurgent Russia. And I'm just saying that to be blunt. I'm just saying that to be direct. I'm not going to pretend that, hey, guys, don't worry about it. Everything's going to be Gucci. If we do even get a peace deal, it could just be seen as a waiting period, a rest period for the Russians to invade again. Because if they're getting internal memos that are being published in the public, so if we know about it, the Russians know about it, I feel exasperated. I feel like I'm kind of stating the obvious here, but holy shit.